now. All right. I think I'm live. Can anyone confirm? I'm not sure. Can you click on YouTube and check if I'm live? I don't know how to check myself. Maybe there's comments on YouTube. Oh yeah, I seem to be live. That's good. That's good. All right. Anyways, perfect. That makes me very happy. All right, and you can all hear me. I don't know if anyone can hear me on YouTube, but I hope so, and I assume so. Yeah. All right. And I think people will be able to hear you too on YouTube. Hello, Ben. Hello, Alice. Hello, everyone here. I'm very happy to see you. All right. Good. So, what are we doing today? We've been reading Difference and Repetition for a while now. Thank you, Lily Tenshoes, for your answers on YouTube. Perfect. So we've been reading Difference and Repetition for a while now, just here privately on the Quarantine Collective. And it's been going good. It happens rarely for a couple of reasons. Difference and Repetition is a lot of work as a book. When chapter 4? Yeah, I'll get to it. Difference and Repetition is a very complicated book, a book that requires a lot of work. It was a dissertation from Gilles Deleuze. It's a part of his dissertation. The other part was his book on Spinoza and expressionism in philosophy. And as a dissertations are these huge works that one does in order to get a proper title in France, right? And dissertations usually imply sort of an engagement with a big part of philosophy. It's not even like our PhD dissertation. It comes even later. Yeah. It's like Deleuze wrote this when he was 40, right? And it has to be a huge proper work. So, yeah, they're all here. Good. And so, as such, it has to really, interact with a really substantial part of philosophy. It has to do something great philosophically, right? If you think of all the dissertations that we read, something like Serre's, like Leibniz and a system, he's like, it's a rethinking of the whole Leibnizianism through structuralism. Deleuze's difference philosophy, the Difference and Repetition also tries to rethink the whole of philosophy in a way and pose it almost like a revolutionary in thought, right? And as such, that means that probably from all his books, even in relation to something like Anti-Oedipus, it is the most dense book. He's really wrestling with basically the whole history of philosophy. And if you read the book yourself, you'll see he goes sort of from Aristotle to Kant, then talks about phenomenology a bit, wrestles a bit with Bergson, with Nietzsche, mentions Hegel, and the book is just all over the place. Ben asks in the chat on the Quarantine Collective, wasn't logic of sense like the residuum of his dissertation, like the sort of the leftover work? I'm not sure, but there is the logic of sense speaks to a very specific part of the project in Difference and Repetition, the notion of the sense, which Deleuze does mention in chapter 3. And I think it was also a series of lectures he was doing. So it was sort of a book written as a series of lectures and as a series and in sort of collaboration with, sort of like in the same time as Difference and Repetition. But yeah, sort of, yeah, he also has a complicated relationship with Difference and Repetition. Lots of it is sort of quote unquote obsolete. Some of it isn't. He both appreciates it and doesn't. He sort of goes away beyond it, but then in retrospect, sometimes he speaks more positively of it. But yeah. So to go back to what we were doing on the Quarantine Collective, so we've been reading it slowly, and the reading is going to continue. So the reading on the Quarantine Collective is going to happen. We're going to read chapter 4 there, and that part isn't going to be streamed because it's very clumsy. We are sort of wrestling together with, you know, complicated concepts. We stumble, we you know, change our minds mid-sentence. It's a sort of a, you know, it's just a messy reading because the book is messy. And I think, you know, if you want to join us through this exploration of difference and repetition, join our Discord server. I think it's linked somewhere in the, you know, link tree in this channel, and you can also then, you know, work with us. Yeah, I will link it in the. Well, I can't link it. Oh yeah, I'll link it in the YouTube chat as well, with my own name, not as a Quarantine Collective. Yeah. Good. So that's it for now. I will switch to our other view. So yeah, to answer your question, Ellis, it's gonna continue. It's gonna be here. I'm waiting for Larvae, which is my sort of like my co-host here, and co-worker. Everybody's a co-worker. I'm waiting for her to come back and so we can continue chapter 4. Chapter 4 is as Jack says, it's the calculus chapter, and it's gonna be probably the most complicated part we've done. We've done it a bit before. I think I'm not the one to speak if it was successful or not, but Ellis was there, part of our like long time co-workers on difference and repetition. Who I don't know. It was a bit, again. It was clumsy. It's a difficult thing. Oh, hey Brooks. Hope you're enjoying seeing someone else on your. Yeah, I saw it. I saw that you're heckling. Okay, so let's switch to difference and repetition, and I made some fancy transitions. Let's see if it all works. Yeah, should switch for you all. Oh my God, how did he do that? I can't tell my secrets. Right. All right. So and now you can see also. Now you can see also the Discord chat and all the messages that people were sending already. Just so everybody knows, if you speak, yeah. I mean, Brooks, join the reading. Join us. Let's talk some difference and repetition. It's gonna be a very relaxed discussion. We're not gonna go too deep into it. So you know, come in and take back the reins, and then I'll add your camera as well if I can. I don't know how to do it really. Or just your voice. No, I have words to write. All right. Okay. Good. Before we start, is there any questions? Yeah. So, Valushka. This is a special sort of retrospective, you know, going back on the book that we've already read. It pays a lip service to sort of a thing that's very important in philosophy. It's sort of even midway through the book, one is supposed to come back. One is supposed to rethink things. One is supposed to restate things. Books are not, at least not Deleuze books, are not supposed to be read linearly from start to end. You're supposed to sort of, you know, mix and match and go back and rethink things, right? So far we've read through basically the first 3 chapters, which is sort of the first part of the book. And that's why I want to sort of to go back, because now we have all the knowledge we've gathered, and we can look back at these passages that we didn't understand well, or we couldn't really think through, or they were not really helpful to us, and rethink them again, right? While at the same time working on continuing the chapter 4. So eventually, as the readings are going to continue, like this sort of retrospective streams and discussions are going to catch up with our regular reading, and they're going to sort of work in tandem with each other. And we're going to be mixing and matching, going maybe back to specific parts and so on. So they're going to continue. I plan to do them at least maybe weekly, maybe every other week. Depends on my time schedule. I can't promise. I have a lot of things to do. But yeah, it's going to continue, right? And I hope it's going to be fun. All right. Is there any questions? Otherwise, I'll go in and discuss DNR, or start discussing DNR. Yeah, and again, I'm not going to be uploading our slow readings of difference and repetition, just because I don't think they're fun for people to listen. They're fun for us, I think, to do, but it's quite different when someone has to listen to me or someone else mumble for half an hour about the thing they sort of half understand. All right. Cool. Oh, and thank you, Brooks, for your wishes. Let's go to the book. So my plan for today simply is to let's go to the contents. Yeah. My plan for today is to talk about this sort of first part of the first section of difference in repetition. We're not going to be reading it slowly like you do in Anti-Oedipus. We're mostly just gonna be talking about the general points that happened there, and recap basically what we've learned. And again, I'm gonna then go linearly through the book, and go get all the way to chapter 3. So we've just finished this chapter in our slow reading a couple of weeks ago. And we're going to go to chapter 4, which is, I think, the longest chapter, but also the most complicated chapter. Like, up until that part, the book is quite difficult, but it's not impossible. And then it becomes impossible. I can't read your name, but Kierkegaard is cited. He's a big part of part 1. I can't pretend I understand what Deleuze really does with Kierkegaard here, because I am not very good at Kierkegaard. So that part, at least I am going to be skipping, but I know there's people who do Kierkegaard very well, and I've met some on the server, so maybe someone will join in and say something about it. Okay, Horizon View is typing. All right, so as I said, to repeat, we're going to be doing sort of this part here and maybe get more, but this is sort of starting couple of pages, maybe 7 pages or so, are sort of setting up ground for why Deleuze even thinks considering repetition matters. But okay, before we start that, let's talk a bit more about the book, right? So as everybody knows, Deleuze has published a fuck ton of books in his life, and most famously, of course, his works with Guattari, Anti-Oedipus and the Thousand Plateaus, the little book on Kafka, which is, I think, less famous, and then, of course, extremely famous and extremely important, What is Philosophy? All of those books, most of those books, I think, other than Thousand Plateaus and the Kafka book, we've read on the server already, and I'm not going to go into those because, again, they're not my expertise. I'm really just a difference and repetition guy here. Right. And so difference and repetition can be read, in my opinion, and some people will differ, as a sort of a book on methodology. It's if you think back to the rationalist tradition, Descartes and Leibniz, and even Kant to an extent, all of those thinkers were sort of grappling with the notion of methodology itself, the way of doing philosophy as such. Hegel, again, big name here. And Deleuze, sort of this sort of tradition of battling with methodology continues explicitly, and especially within the continental tradition, what one would call continental tradition, with phenomenology and then post-phenomenology, right? And then you get something like genealogy in Nietzsche, which then gets picked up by Foucault. You get structuralism, right, which also has great concerns with methodology. And this structuralism is sort of where Deleuze comes in, and he takes up the reins of structuralism, as will become quite clear, in order to rethink the way of doing philosophy itself, right? So for Deleuze, this book, it's about the doing philosophy itself. David Lapoujade, who's a great thinker on Deleuze, I have his book here, and I highly recommend it. Aberrant Movements describes much of Deleuze's philosophy as a philosophy of logic. Of course, we have the two great books, The Logic of Sensation and The Logic of Sense. But Lapoujade goes further and, for example, characterizes Anti-Oedipus as a book on logic of desire, right? And you can characterize some other books as well. I forgot how exactly he names those books, but importantly, he sort of goes through all the books and leaves out difference and repetition. And this is crucial, and I think he's right to leave out difference and repetition from this tradition of the thinking of logic in Deleuze, because that's not what difference and repetition does. It's not a logic of anything, but it sort of forms a field, sort of a method in which Deleuze can rethink these different logics, including the logic of desire, the logic of sense, the logic of sensation, the logic of subjectivation in parts of the Foucault book, right? Or the logic of concept, maybe, for what is philosophy. So in this way, I guess this is what makes difference and repetition also stand out a bit more and add to its complexity. It's the notion that the Deleuze that we're used to from difference and repetition on isn't here. This is a Deleuze who's explicitly positing a methodology and doing basically only that. And this is most explicit in the third chapter, which we've just finished, and we'll get to it in time, right? But first, okay. So, any questions before that, or else I'll just go on as a sort of a recap of what's happening here.
I have a question.
Please do.
Is repetition because this is the first time I encountered Deleuze, right?
Yeah.
But is this repetition relate to the repetition that Hume talk about in the repetitiveness of our impression, the repeated appetite custom, right? That our imagination, the repetitiveness of our imagination, right? Or I'm wrong about it.
No. So shortly, yes. The Deleuze's thinking of repetition focuses on repetition in general throughout the philosophy. So when he really discusses repetition, and like when he discusses repetition as it's, you know, on its own in second chapter, he goes through Hume, he discusses Kant, he discusses Bergson, right? He really just he goes back and he discusses Freud again, like as in this, you know, because repetition played a huge part in Freud. He discusses structuralism. He's really focused on everything in philosophy, because it's a sort of a book that reflects on the philosophy as a whole, from these two concepts that Deleuze picks up, that he thinks were not given proper theoretical, you know, work up until him, the notion of difference and repetition, right? So, and even when we look at the notion of difference itself, again, Deleuze is going to basically go through the whole of philosophy up until Nietzsche, and then in Plato as well, in Aristotle. So he's trying to rethink the history of philosophy itself as well. Hume, of course, plays there a role, but so does every thinker who has grappled even a little bit with the notion of repetition. But we'll get to Hume in a second. He already in the first chapter he mentions him. Right. Okay, I say we I want to just read the first line of the book and to so get us started, because this is where he sets up his thinking. It's, you know, we skipped the preface. Preface is mostly just about him, the way he writes. But let's talk about repetition, right? He says in introduction, repetition is not generality. Repetition and generality must be distinguished in several ways. Every formula which implies their confusion is regrettable. For example, when we say that two things are alike as two drops of water, or when we identify there is only a science of the general with there is only science of that which is repeated, repetition and resemblance are different in kind, extremely so. I'll just continue the next paragraph and then we'll stop. Generality presents two major orders: the qualitative order of resemblance and the quantitative order of equivalences. Cycles and equalities are their respective symbols. But in any case, generality expresses a point of view according to which one term may be exchanged or substituted for another. The exchange or substitution of particulars defines our conduct in relation to generality. That is why the empiricists are not wrong to present the general ideas as particular ideas in themselves, so long as they add the belief that each of these can be replaced with any other particular idea which resembles it in relation to a given word. By contrast, we see that the repetition is a necessary and justified conduct only in relation to that which cannot be replaced. Repetition as a conduct and as a point of view concerns non-exchangeable and non-substitutable singularities. Reflections, echoes, doubles, and souls do not belong to the domain of resemblance or equivalence. And it is no more possible to exchange one's soul than it is to substitute real twins for one another. If exchange is the criterion of generality, theft and gift are those of repetition. There is therefore an economic difference between the two. This is a wonderful and a very complicated start to a book. And so when although this is written in a very complicated and convoluted sense, what Deleuze is saying is actually quite simple. He is contrasting two terms that have generally been sort of thought together, and that is repetition and generality. So you can think of, so let's focus on the term of generality just for a second. It generally functions as, we can talk about like generalizing, right? When you see a certain animal with 4 legs and a tail that wags when it's happy or excited, and a mouth, and fur, you see those animals in nature, and they repeat often, and you see them often. You might just generalize and call this animal a dog. So instead of calling every particular animal by its name and just creating a name for everything, you sort of just say, hey, I call this repeating thing that I see a dog, or I call this repeating thing I see a horse, or this tall, brown and green repeating thing I see tree. And so there is a certain almost commonsensical idea in philosophy that repetition and this form of generalization have to be connected. Because, we wouldn't generalize things that don't repeat, right? But Deleuze, for a reason we will see soon, discards that, right? And yeah, of course, as 92 says in the chat, the resemblance, right? They've posted a very, very nice translation of the word that goes resemble, be like, have likeness, similarity, to appear, to seem, to be like, right? So there is a resemblance, repetition, and that's in this realm of generality is connected to the notion of resemblance, and as Deleuze says in the next sentence right here, he says generality presents 2 major orders: the qualitative order of resemblances and the quantitative order of equivalences. Cycles and equalities are their respective symbols. Things either repeats, think of the the seasons which repeat, and we can number them. We can create these huge, complicated calendar systems from them. But all of this functions from generality, and it also functions from this idea of a repetition that is connected to this generality. And then my example with horses and dogs sort of functions through this example of resemblance, right? A sort of particular resemblance that happens every day. And at the end of this paragraph, we get a very, very provocative statement by Deleuze. So this is him stating clearly what he's doing and what he's going to do, and how he's going to rethink repetition differently. And it's quite exciting. And he says, it starts here when he says repetition as a conduct and as a point of view concerns non-exchangeable and non-substitutable singularities. Reflections, echoes, doubles, and souls do not belong to the domain of resemblance or equivalence. Right? He's gonna equate repetition with this weird term that he just introduces here. He sort of hints at it, but he's not going to discuss it quite yet because he can't. You sort of need basically most of the book to get to it. The notion of singularity. What repeats is not the generals, but the singulars, right? And this is his sort of transformation, or this sort of his radical move in the domain of repetition, right? Difference has its own thing, and these two are intrinsically connected, right? But now we are just talking about repetition in this short part. So the question is, so singularities, right? You should just keep that in mind. That's the that's our starting point, right? So so far, he hasn't really said anything, right? And Deleuze sort of. So is that clear so far? Is there any comments on this? I'm glad to hear anyone say anything, so I don't have to speak all the time, and I can take a sip of my drink, my caffeinated tea. All right. Anything on YouTube? Let's see. All right. Good. Yeah. Deleuze explicitly talks about repetition and music and rhythm, and you're gonna see it quite quickly. I think it comes also quite soon. I'm not sure. I've not intimately gotten back to these parts in a while. That's why I'm doing it now, because it's fun, and I'm having to re-explain these things that I've talked about 2 years ago. I don't know if anyone was here 2 years ago when we were first reading this. I just remember a completely different crowd. All right. So, one of the first questions that pops to mind when someone thinks about repetition and, divorcing repetition from generality and, and putting it into the notion of the singular is science. So Deleuze sort of anticipates immediately one sort of immediately would jump to, and at least it would be maybe in retrospect my jump as well, to go to laws of nature, and then to think, well, there we see a clear instance of repetition that fits extremely well into this notion of generality, right? Just think of the when one considers let's take the Newtonian gravity. You can calculate it to almost a perfect extent. You have these sort of laws, natural laws, which one can calculate, which then one can observe set in motion, and these calculations point towards a nature that repeats itself in a specific way. And even science functions in a way where one can create generalities which one then can empirically test and which repeat the expected results. So repetition has to be, at least from the point of view of Deleuze, extremely intimately connected with the notion of science, with the notion of law. Right. So I'll just read a bit here so we can talk about it through Deleuze, right? As he says, on the other hand, generality belongs to the orders of laws. However, laws determine only the resemblance of the subject ruled by it, along with their equivalences to the term which it designates. Far from grounding repetition, laws show rather how repetition would remain impossible for the pure subject of the law. Particular. It condemns them to change. as an empty form of difference, an invariable form of variation, a law compels its subject to illustrate it only at the cost of their own change. No doubt, there are as many constants as variables among the terms designated by laws, and as many permanences and preservations as there are fluxes and variations in nature. However, a preservation is still not a repetition. The constants of one law are in turn variables of a more general law, just as the hardest rock becomes soft and fluid matter on the genealogical scale of millions of years. So at each level, it is in relation to large, permanent natural objects that the subject of law experiences its own powerlessness to repeat and discover that this powerlessness is already contained in the object, reflected in the permanent object wherein it sees itself condemned. Law unites the change of water and the permanence of the river. Elie IV, I don't know how to read this, said of Otto, he imbued it with the utmost transitories, those things which our gaze encounters at the most enduring, namely space and forest. Right. And then just a further bit down, so we skip these examples. He says, if repetition is possible, it is due to the miracle rather than to law. It is against the law, against a similar form and the equivalent content of law. If repetition can be found, even in nature, it is in the name of power which affirms itself against law, which works underneath laws, perhaps superior laws. If repetition exists, it expresses at once a singularity opposed to the general, a universality opposed to the particular, a distinctive opposed to the ordinary, an instantaneity opposed to variation, and an eternity opposed to permanence. In every respect, repetition is a transgression. It puts laws into questions. It denounces its nominal or general character in favor of a more profound and more artistic reality. So this is a very colorful and a bit convoluted part of the book, in my opinion. Yeah, but its point, when considered less abstractly, I think, and you can disagree with me, and please do. Its point, when considered less abstractly, is simply that laws, when we consider laws of nature, even in their functioning, they don't really pertain to repetition as such, because they obscure sort of a more fundamental repetition happening, right? So laws are always trying to sort of stabilize nature so that it can be explainable directly through these laws. And in this way, they have to sort of do violence to the thing itself, to the nature itself, and sort of limit it in a way in which, nature doesn't want to be limited. And one can give many examples of this. I can just let's go back to the notion of gravity, right? It's one of the most successfully posited, quote unquote, laws of nature, Newtonian gravity. It's for hundreds of years, it was a paradigm of modern physics. And it posited this generality which sort of tried to appreciate the way in which everything with mass has to obey these laws and repeat them. But nature doesn't function this way. And so immediately, as soon as one developed a more advanced ways of measuring, one noticed that, for example, Mercury doesn't obey it. and this was a problem. So you get these, you immediately get, you know, like your whole universe basically collapses if it's built on this specific law, because reality does not really function this way. So it always sort of evades being placed into specific notion of the law. And this problem of the mercury, of course, got solved with Einstein and his rethinking of gravity. But of course, this is not enough, because even Einstein has his problem, has its holes. One of the big problems for Einstein is, and his whole, you know, theories of relativity is its incompatibility with something like quantum mechanics. All right, Magdura has a question, and you say, do you think it is a transgression, as said, I see transposing of how understanding is understood unto the naturally unknowable, which is a closed system, and these guys seem to be hyper aware of that. I think that Deleuze uses the notion of the transgression here quite, you know, sort of as a sort of a joke, because I mean, what one transgresses is always laws, and when one thinks of transgression, one thinks of, you know, transgressing moral laws. Deleuze is simply equating this sort of transgression of the moral law, you know, do not, you know, like fetishes, or like do not murder or whatever, with the transgression that nature itself has against natural laws. Sort of a joke. I think it reads better in French. I hope, at least. What I've read of Deleuze in French, I've seen that he can be very funny, but it's not always. It doesn't always translate that well into English. It's same with Marx and German. If one reads if one just reads Marx in German, one sees how funny Marx is, and how snarky he is, and he has this like dry humor that's amazing. But it just doesn't translate very well into English at all. And like a lot of his dry wit is missed, which is a shame. Oh, same with someone like Leibniz. Leibniz is read like a very dry writer, but I've read his stuff in French a bit, and I've read his stuff in Latin, and he is very funny. So I think, you know, it's a shame. Arachne asks, is difference in repetition related to Spinoza and the problem of expression, to your knowledge? Yes, in a way. Expression plays a big role in the later chapters, and especially the way in which. So I don't. I'm not gonna. Actually, you know what? I'm not gonna go into the notion of expression. Just so you know, his books on expressionism was written as a second part of his dissertation. Right, this is the first part. And expression comes later in chapter 4 and 5, especially chapter 5, and the way in which Deleuze understands it. Maybe he will not use always the term expression, but he uses, you know, different words. He explains things differently. So yeah, it's very connected, and it's he has this sort of like almost inverted Spinozism, but I think it's a bit complicated to get into it now. Although I would be happy to, you know. It's very academic as well. You're right. It's extremely difficult. I I read it once. I don't plan to go back to it anytime soon. Yeah, he's an amazing reader of Spinoza. Right. I think you can all hear my Discord, and I don't know how to mute these Discord notifications, if it's even possible. All right. Anyways, let's go on. So, natural law. Oh yeah, and Alice, no problem. I know you are European like me, and just go to sleep, and we'll discuss chapter 4 quite soon. I promise. So, let's go on. So here we see sort of one of the big problems of equating generality with repetition itself is the simple fact that there appears to be a lack of the ability of, really properly subsuming those two, right? A repetition almost seems to imply more than can be really done with the notion of generality. And that's his point here, sort of. And this is where he sort of goes on to discuss the notion of the experiment, right? And let's just read. Let's just read this next part, and I think it's quite helpful. He says, from the point of view of scientific experiment, it seems difficult to deny a relationship between repetition and law. However, we must ask under what conditions experimentation ensures repetition. Natural phenomena are produced in a free state, whereas any inference is possible among the vast cycles of resemblances. In this sense, everything reacts on everything else, and everything else resembles. Just a second. Yeah. And everything else resembles everything else. Resemblance of the diverse with itself. However, experimentation constitutes relatively closed environments in which phenomena are defined in terms of a small number of chosen factors. A minimum of 2, for example, space and time, for the movement of bodies in vacuum. Consequently, there is no reason to question the application of mathematics to physics. Physics is already mathematical, since the closed environments or the chosen factors also constitute systems of geometrical coordinates. In these conditions, phenomena necessarily appear as equal to a certain quantitative relation between the chosen factors. Experimentation is thus a matter of substituting one order of generality for another, an order of equality for an order of resemblance. Resemblances are unpacked in order to discover an equality which allows the identification of a phenomenon under the particular condition of the experiment. Repetition appears here only in a passage from one generality to another, emerging with the help of, or on the occasion of, this passage. It is as if repetition momentarily appears beneath or underneath the two generalities. Here too, however, there is a risk of a mistaking a difference in kind for difference in a degree. This is Bergson. For generality only presents and presupposes a hypothetical repetition, given the same circumstances then. This formula says that in a similar situation, one will always be able to retain the same factors which represent the being equal of phenomena. This, however, does not account for what gives rise to repetition, nor what is categorical or important for repetition in a principle. I'll skip the brackets. In its essence, repetition refers to a singular power which differs in kind from generality, even when, in order to appear, it takes advantage of the artificial passage from one order of generality to another. This is I don't know if you can see all of it. Maybe not. I don't know if you saw the whole. Oh, I should have scrolled down. I'm very sorry. Yeah, this is where it ends. I'm not very good at tracking what my stream is showing. I'm new at this. Anyways, we are at the crux of the problem, and Deleuze here is announcing basically his critique of general thinking of repetition, right? General. In the last passages, he's sort of getting to it properly. So, science does experiments. It provides us with a sort of repetition that can be demonstrated. But as Deleuze says here, importantly, right, as he says here in just here in the above, right, he says, however, we must ask under what condition experimentation ensures repetition. So the point is, much more than simply providing us with repetition as its own, what experiments do, functioning under the notion of the law, which we have announced just before, scientific experiments, based on the law, create sort of spaces in which repetition can happen. They sort of construct these spaces of the ability to create repeating instances under the law, right? Think of when you do any experiment, like we can be any simple experiment, right? You're not sort of interacting directly with the nature as such. You are first and foremost, and every scientist knows this because this is sort of part of the scientific method, is to establish sort of variables that are important and which are going to be researched in the experiment as such. You can't do everything, so you need to sort of so you need to cut down, you need to cut down on it, you need to place variables in focus, right? Think of what's that thinker that said it? I'm blanking on it. Ayer, yeah, A.J. Ayer, right? He was he's an analytic philosopher, right? But he touches, logical pause, but he touches on the problem that Deleuze himself here is doing. Like for example, for R.G. Ayer, right? He was for a bunch of his philosophy, he was battling with the notion of natural law and what natural law means, right? And he posits this as this repeated instances of cases where there is an equivalence between events, sort of, right? This is a law when all cases as such happen in the same sort of way, but also, and so that everything is a law, because you need to sort of encase it, because then you can sort of like throw a dice can be a natural law as well, right? Or you can say stuff like all what's the example they use? Yeah, all dices are smaller than a square kilometer. Therefore you have this repeating instance. Therefore, it's a natural law that dices are smaller than a kilometer cubed, which is sort of a nonsense. Like, why would that be a natural law? That's just like you don't really it's not really in the fundamental nature, right? So what he says, we need to add to it another condition, which says that these natural laws have a privileged position within our within our research, right? It's not simply that we see these equivalences. We also have to put it. It has to sort of take a leading charge and have the ability to explain other things. And Deleuze is basically repeating that same thing here. And he wouldn't, maybe, I don't think he would disagree with these logical positivists in their description of the natural law. But, for him, the notion of repetition here is then sort of misaligned, because we're not really thinking of repetition its own way. We are constructing ways in which repetition, a specific type of repetition, can happen, another repetition in general. And that's the problem, right, with experimentation, right? And he says here we get chosen factors, right, for movement. We get time and space, for movement of bodies in vacuums, right? Right. So it's sort of difficult to rethink this notion of, repetition through law. Right. And why is this a problem then, right? Why can't we just say, okay, repetition as such is the only way we can think of it. Let's just leave it under this notion of generality and, have it that way. It's not even that important. Well, Deleuze thinks that we are mistaking here, because there is a way of thinking about repetition differently, and we are fooling ourselves into not exploring the whole of it, right? We're not thinking to the end. And he says it here in this sentence, and this is crucial. This is basically his critique. He says, this, however, does not account for what gives rise to repetition, not for what is categorical or important for repetition in principle. So this kind of repetition, this repetition that happens within a law, can be posited, but we do not understand why things repeat. We can generalize things, but we do not understand the conditions under which things themselves repeat. And as we'll see, this is basically Deleuze's philosophy, to understand ways under which, things come to be. So the ways things are generated, things generate themselves in nature, right? But simply limiting ourselves to the notion of the law, observing how things are repeated and implying a sort of a future repetition from it, does not explain to us, at least from Deleuze's point of view, the genesis of this repetition as such. And there's a way in which one can call Deleuze's philosophy genetic philosophy, because even up until the end, he's sort of really focused on the way in which things come to be. Think of, for example, Anti-Oedipus, right? He's not so much focused on what desire is, but he wants to understand, how do we come to desire? How do these structures of desire come to be? That's his whole thing, and this is sort of he's laying his groundwork here, thinking about these notions such as scientific law and scientific experiment. Right. So within these starting chapters of Deleuze, of difference and repetition, there is already a critique of sort of scientism, of logical positivism, maybe not exactly, but of the notion that one can simply explain things in nature simply by generalities. All right. We will never completely get to the bottom of it. We can talk about Deleuze, this idea of the bottom of it later, and how there is no bottom. but we will never get to the bottom of it simply by, positing laws of nature, right? And this goes us back to this great idea that we see in, for example, modern physics, especially someone like Hawking, right? It's this great push for the unifying theory of everything. That's the most generalized generality, right? And in the previous paragraph that we just read, Deleuze is sort of already alluding to the impossibility. Like, these laws of repetitions always exist under specific frameworks, which are always bigger, right? But as soon as you leave that framework, it collapses. His example, very beautifully said, is the idea that one can generalize sort of this repetition that stone and rocks are always hard, but on a time frame of massive geological movement of millennia and millions and millions of years, those seemingly stable natural laws become fluid, right? And hard bodies become fluid under the pressure of the changing times, which is quite beautiful, right? So there is a sort of a Heraclitean push towards, pantarei, everything changes, and because of this, we can't really equate things just with their laws. And Deleuze isn't alone here, right? He's a bit early in doing this, right? But if one wants this from this point of view of physics, you've probably all heard of her. She's amazing. I'm sorry. She's amazing. Her name is Karen Barad. She is a physicist and a philosopher who wrote a book. What's her? Does anyone know her book here? I think Jack is gone. I would have asked Jack. But Universe That Matters, is that the book? Wait, I'll Google for a second. Did my microphone just crash? No. I think it's Karen Barad. Oh yeah. No, I'm sorry. It's not how it's called. It's called Meeting the Universe Halfway. It's a great book. And in this book, she sort of tries to rethink our nature with science itself. And she goes back to a physicist called Niels Bohr. And Niels Bohr, in his battling with I would say with quantum mechanics of his time and quantum physics, he proposed a rethinking of the experiment as such, under the notion that he has called the phenomena. And for Niels Bohr, natural phenomena are not found simply in nature, but they are produced between two agents. One of those agents is nature as expressed through our scientific apparatus, right? Because every time we try to work through things, we're always using technology through which we filter science, right? And then our observation as such. And this meeting point between the two is what he calls the phenomena, right? So natural phenomena are sort of constructed, but he's not sort of this social constructivist, and neither is Deleuze. This is important, right? It's not simply that we imagine them socially, but they come from this interaction, of nature and ourselves and the way in which it interacts. So it's a bit more complicated than that. And it's an amazing book, Meeting Universe Halfway. I recommend it. It's one of the more influential books in physics, and it's not as I think it repeats a lot of what Deleuze does. but it's not as complicated to read. And she goes with Foucault as well, and with the notion of episteme, and so on. It's a really good book. I've done quite a bit of work around it, and I had also a privilege to speak with her, which was amazing. Right. So that's science. Is there any questions? Does anyone want to talk science? Please do. I will. Okay, so I see there's a question. Makdura asks, is he simply pointing out that we are what allows repetition? No. That would be a very simple sort of anthropocentric view that Deleuze himself would try to avoid, because it would again, like, us allowing. I don't know if you're still here, but oh no, you aren't. Well, I'm just going to answer a question for everyone. Subsuming the notion of repetition under a human will still subsume repetition under a generality, right? If we are what allows repetition, you would get, humans which you would get this. You would still have to explain the notion of the human, same as and these discrepancies between human and the and the natural, right, as that which evades and transgresses repetition, and you would go back to the same problem, right? So it doesn't help us really. He's going to have a much more radical notion of repetition, but we're not going there yet, right? We're simply saying for now with the science. Maybe the world existed before the French language and we just don't know it. Maybe. We will never know. French have fooled us into thinking they have created the world, which would be great, right? So that leaves us. Let's see what happens here. That leaves us. That ends our discussion of science, right? And Deleuze sort of concludes, as we've said, you can't repetition. While we can sort of subsume repetition under the notion of generality, what we cannot do is explain this repetition itself, right? This form of repetition, which happens in the natural laws, which is an interesting argument, right? Okay, Arachne, you're writing. I'll let you write and then I'll go on to the other section. We can take a little break. I've been speaking for a while. Wasn't Ajay error associated with emotivism? I'll not answer that. I'll let Jack answer that. They probably know way more than I do about this thinker. I have my limited scope of philosophical knowledge. All right. It's perfectly fine not to know. One of the most amazing things about reading such enormous tomes of philosophy, such as Difference and Repetition, is that it humbles a person instantly, right? I mean, reading Kant, reading Hegel, reading Spinoza, reading Deleuze, anyone, I am just humbled. I feel humbled constantly. And almost, there's always almost a fear to even speak about philosophy because there is these monumental texts that are infinite in complexity, and people have thought them and rethought them and reworked them and found out new things that is it's just daunting. And it's same with the difference repetition. It's not a simple text. It leaves a lot of things unanswered, a lot of things that Deleuze himself has battled with basically his whole life, right? And some of things he isn't even happy with. Spoilers, difference and repetition is a very structuralist text. It's not so critical of structuralism as much as it tries to think things through structuralism. And when he meets Guattari writes this amazing little text called Machine and Structure, where he criticizes Deleuze for being sort of stuck within structure itself. Deleuze appreciates it and drops it. He drops structuralism and goes towards the machinic with Guattari. And what I find there amazing in that sort of section, or sort of that sort of move, right? Same as I find in Freud, this sort of amazing is the courage to simply rethink one's philosophy. There's this honesty in being like, oh shit, I was wrong. I need to rethink it. Freud did it. Freud was rethinking his shit all the fucking time. He was, it's. I don't know if you read his the 3 essays on sexuality. It's clear that, and if you like read the later editions with so infinite footnotes, it's a text that has the most fucking footnotes. One sees how much he's actually was himself, battling and wanting to change his theories and trying to, understand. And there's this, and in my opinion, there is this honesty in there. And I love that. And there's this honesty in Deleuze too, to simply go beyond what one was doing through the intervention of another person, right? Not many thinkers do that. Another thinker who did that, who I respect a lot, was someone like Badiou, who, seeing as his theory of subjectivity, was not functioning. He changed his. You ask, I don't understand what dropping structural means, frankly. In 1,000 of laws, several regimes of science, the right to desire is identical with structure. Dropping structuralism here would mean dropping structuralism as a theoretical framework through which sort of everything is understood. Because, so for Guattari, the notion of structure fails insofar as it doesn't account for its own structuring. So if you start with a structure and these sort of differential relations, as Deleuze starts here, and you want to do this sort of genetic philosophy that Deleuze does, you need to be able to do account of the structure of the structure, right? There is sort of a pre-structural element, pre-signifying element, through which everything is structured. And so for Guattari, that's the notion of the machinic, right? And although desire is identical with the structure, right? Desire is structured through the notion of the desiring machine, which then, functions as this sort of a logical precursor to structure itself. Does that make sense? Right. I mean, have you read the Machine and Structure from Guattari? Honestly, like that text is going to make everything clear. It is like his critique of Deleuze. I think there is a PDF on the Quarantine Collective, and it really helps. Especially if you're trying to think differences between something like logic of sense or difference in repetition and anti-Oedipus, right? It's extremely helpful, and I would recommend everyone. It's like 6 pages. It's not even long. But this is what impressed Deleuze so much. Yeah. Oh, Three Ecologies is also great. I've done quite a lot of work on it. So much to read. Yeah, Guattari and Deleuze were although Guattari was less prolific than Deleuze in his writing, his writing was also he also wrote a bunch. Oh, thank you, Ben. Okay, Ben has linked Machine and Structure. I will link it into the YouTube chat if anyone's interested. Right, there we go. There's a PDF. Enjoy it. It's a really good essay. Actually, Ben, you are the one who showed me that essay. Do you know that? I had no idea of its existence before you. Yeah, I think you pasted it in one of the mod chats back in the day, like years ago. And I was like, huh? Yeah, it's you had this sort of proselytizing moment where you were like, hey, you have to read this. I was like, yes, sir. It makes things so much clearer. And ever since anyone who has touched Anti-Oedipus, I was always like, read this essay beforehand, especially if they have some experience with Deleuze. All right, let's go on. I think we've taken a little break. I think either Barun or Jack turned me on to. Yeah, I mean, this is what I'm saying. This is why Quarantine Collective is such a valuable resource. I don't know where I would be with my understanding of Deleuze were it not for the amazing work that is just being done everywhere around it. To be honest, like this, me just like talking right now and interpreting this is not, it's not my own work. As I've said, we spent a lot of time here, and I mean a lot of time discussing, talking, working through it. I get DMs. We spent hours upon hours in voice chats, sometimes fighting over concepts, disagreeing passionately, but also and so everything. I think all of our all of our understanding, like Brooks and everyone who is working so hard on AO, and when Brooks speaks about AO and sort of explains it to people and works through it, or anyone else here really. It's a product of a sort of a collective work, and it's definitely true for my understanding of difference in repetition, because I can sit at home and I can repeat this book ad nauseum, and of course every time I reread it I will learn something new. But once I get to talk to people and people point to different things and people help me understand differently, when they have their own thoughts that that are exchanged and like translated between people, it works great. Right. So yeah. Right, so let's go on. So now we've done with the notion of the natural law, right? But there is another type of law that one might think about when one thinks of repetition, and especially in relation to Kant. It's the idea of moral law. And this is what Deleuze says here. This is sort of how he introduces it. He says, expecting repetition from the law of nature is the Stoic error. The wise must be converted into virtuous. The dream of finding a law which would make repetition possible passes over to the moral sphere. There is always a task to recommence, a fidelity to be revived within a daily life, indistinguishable from the reaffirmation of duty. Büchner makes Danton say, "It is so wearisome. First you put on your shirt, then your trousers. You drag yourself into bed at night, and in the morning drag yourself out again. And always you put one foot in front of the other. There's little hope that it will ever change. Millions have always done it like that, and million more will do after us. Moreover, since we are made up of two halves, which both do the same thing, everything's done twice. It is all very boring and very, very sad. Amazing, right? So in this little section, and I don't think we need to sort of talk about the Stoic error and what that means. I'm not even sure I know what it means, or I'm not even competent to explain it. But we can, like, Deleuze sort of shifts from observation of the natural law towards the observation of human behavior, towards the observation of the morality, right? There is this notion of is and ought that is touched upon here, which, Deleuze plays with, and weaving through it a notion of repetition. Right? Stoic error, change your mind, but never change the world. I think that's that, yeah. Hegel, in Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel describes this Stoicism as sort of retreating from the world, right? It's before the unhappy consciousness, right? There's the Stoicism, the skepticism, and then the unhappy consciousness, right? But sort of the first type of consciousness that Hegel describes is this Stoic consciousness, which negates the world in order to preserve itself in its purity. I think that's the Stoic error, maybe. Yeah, you're right, Jack. Thank you for that. But enough about Hegel. And that's purely enough about Hegel, purely because I have no idea how to talk about Hegel. I refuse to, be trapped by Hegel. I had a class on Hegel, this seminar, and I've not said a fucking word in there because it's just so complicated that I don't know. Hegel, right. But what is there, I think what also is a play here is this notion of the difference between is and ought, right? The repetition that we see naturally and repetition that we want to pose against this natural repetition, right? Because think for, and we're gonna come to Kant in a second, but we can talk about it beforehand, right? Think about Kant, right? What signifies his moral law is that it's free from the natural law, right? Morality itself has nothing to do with nature. It's free insofar, and insofar as it provides us the possibility of determining our own action away from the necessity that is presented in the natural law, right? Schiller, taking upon Kant, right? And Schiller was amazing. He really appreciated the second critique. So Schiller puts it in the notion of two drives. Like humanity is split between two drives: the drive of necessity, which he calls the Sachtrieb, right? The matter drive, and the form drive, which is the thing that can form matter, right? But there's this freedom in the form which stands above. Like it has to be necessarily independent of the necessity, right? So for Kant, morality is inherently described by this notion of freedom. And it's the notion that one can do contrary to the necessity, contrary to the inclination, right? This is what frees morality, right? So maybe moral law sets us free. Yeah, that's exactly how Kant will describe it. So maybe we get a proper repetition here, right? Maybe there is a way to rethink repetition and to think it better in the notion of the moral law, which itself, is above any natural law, and thus better. Right. Let's read a bit of this paragraph. Is there any questions, by the way? I know there is not too many people currently watching, but or there. It is a small reading, and it's kind of also better when it's small. But I will happily see if anyone wants to say anything. Right. Okay. So let's read this part just for a bit, and I think we can sort of stop after this, because I've been talking about difference and repetition for a while already. I say we finish the section on the moral law, and then next time we'll probably skip the next section on Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. I'm very sorry to all the Kierkegaardians, unless there is an explicit wish. If anyone here like really, really, really wants to discuss Kierkegaard, I will gladly. But it's not my domain. I can maybe bullshit about it. Right. All right, let's read this part. However, what good is a moral law if it doesn't sanctify reiteration? Above all, if it does not make reiteration possible and gives us legislative power, God, I'm bad at reading, from which we are all excluded by the law of nature. Moralists sometimes present the categories of good and evil in the following manner. Every time we try to repeat according to the nature or as natural beings, we throw ourselves into a demonic and already damned exercise, which can end only in despair or boredom. The good, by contrast, holds out the possibility of repetition, the successful of repetition, and of the spirituality of repetition, because it depends not upon a law of nature, but on a law of duty, of which, as moral beings, we cannot be subjects without also being legislators. What is Kant's highest test, if not a criterion, which should decide what can in principle be reproduced? In other words, what can be repeated without contradiction in the form of moral law. The man of duty invented the test of repetition. He decided what in principle could be repeated. He thought he had thereby defeated both the demonic and the worrisome. Moreover, as an echo of Danton's concern, or a response to them, is there not a moralist in that repetition apparatus described with such precision by Kant's biographers, right down to the astonishing garters that he made for himself, and the regularity of his daily promenades? So yeah, this is what I was saying just a second ago. You know, morality sort of allows us to maybe not so much think of repetition as something that can be described simply as a natural thing that we observe. And this is, back towards the comment that we had here, like the humans prescribed repetition, but that would be Kant, right? Like, at least Deleuzean reading of Kant. I don't know if Kant would agree with this framing, or any Kantian would agree of this framing as it's like a test of repetition, right? Because it's sort of an ethical way of understanding repetition, right? So the question here is this prescriptive repetition, sort of repetition as a transcendent law which we follow, which allows us to select proper repetitions. Is this a repetition that can is this a repetition which can, provide a sort of proper term, independent, or like proper independent term of repetition? I've been saying repetition too much, so I confuse myself there, right? The problem is, do we solve problems of science through the means of morality? Spoiler alert, no, we don't. For Deleuze, right? This is the start of the problem, right? Let's read this part. I think this part is going to be interesting to people here because it's about habit, right? I just want to read it for you all. Right. It says, conscience, however, suffers from the following ambiguity. It can be conceived only by supposing the moral law to the external, superior, and indifferent to the natural law. But the application of the moral law can be conceived only by restoring to conscience itself the image and the model of the law of nature. As a result, the moral law, far from giving us true repetition, still leaves us in generality. This time, the generality is not of nature, but that of habit as a second nature. It is useless to point to the existence of immoral or bad habits. It is the form of habit, or as Bergson used to say, the habit of acquiring habit, the whole of obligation, which is essentially moral, or has the form of the good. Furthermore, in this whole or generality of habit, we again find the two major orders, that of resemblance, in the variable conformity of the element of action with a given model, insofar as the habit has not been acquired, and that of equivalence, with the equality of the elements of action in different situations once the habit has been acquired. As a result, habit never gives rise to true repetition. Sometimes the action changes and is preferred while the intention remains constant. Sometimes the action remains the same in different contexts and with different intentions. There again, if repetition is possible, it would appear only beneath the two generalities of perfection and integration, testifying to the presence of a quite different power at the risk of overturning these two generalities. I'll just finish this next paragraph, I think, and then we can, we can discuss it and then stop it, right? If repetition is possible, it is as such opposed to moral law, as it is to natural law. There are two known ways to overturn moral law. One is by ascending towards a principle, challenging the law as a secondary, derived, borrowed, or general, denouncing it as involved, a second-hand principle which diverts an original force or usurps an original power. The other way, by contrast, is to overturn the law by descending towards the consequence, to which one submits with a too perfect attention to detail. By adopting the law, a falsely submissive soul manages to evade it and to taste pleasure it was supposed to forbid. We can see this in demonstration by absurdity, and working to rule, but also in some forms of masochist behavior, which mock by submission. The first way of overturning the law is ironic, where irony appears as the art of principle, of ascent towards a principle and of overturning principle. The second is humor, which is an art of consequences and descents, of suspensions and falls. Must we understand that repetition appears in both this suspense and this ascent, enter the existence recommenced and reiterated itself once it is no longer constrained by law? Repetition belongs to humor and irony. It is by nature transgression or exception, always revealing a singularity opposed to the particulars subsumed under the laws, a universal opposed to the generalities which give rise to the laws. Right. A wonderful example. And as Ben already says in the chat, Deleuze is referencing coldness and cruelty. Also, he's referencing, Mazoch himself. Have you read Mazoch, Ben? Have you read Venus in Pelz, the Venus in Fur? You can neither confirm nor deny. Oh yeah, maybe it's a bit, it's not a book one admits to reading, but I've read it. And what I can surely say in German, which is in the original, like I have it right here. It's a beautiful little version by Sokamp. It also has coldness and cruelty, like the essay. Have you noticed how funny Mazoch is? Is incredibly funny. Like how most of the book is just jokes. And I mean I don't know if I should spoil the book for people. Like if you don't want the book spoiled, close your ears. But it's it's a 150-year-old book, so fuck it. There's this amazing moment where at the end of the book, like sort of Mazoch is sort of like, well, what have you learned? Like the main character, like what have you learned from this story? And I love this moment. And the guy says, and it's like the whole book is about this tension between these two and like the games they play, possession and depossession and so on, and like it's sort of this like complicated relationship, right? Whereas one has to submit to the other. The main character like sort of submits and wants the woman submit to him, and there's this like really interesting interplay of possession and submission that happens there, right? And the whole story is basically about this. It's not a very erotic story. Like, but reading, like, if you want to read Mazoch, like, you can. There's nothing like. It's just a bunch of beating happening around. It's not like Bataille or the Sade. Yeah, but there's this moment, and like then it's like okay, so this whole thing about submission, like, what was this all about? Like, why did we get this story? And the main character says, "Oh, it's because men and women are not equal." Were they equal, like politically? Like were women to get equality and be really equal citizens to men, we wouldn't have this problem of like chase and submission. And this like funny moment of like where he's like, yeah, I don't know if this would happen if like we didn't live in a patriarchy. And I just love it. It's so awesome. It's my favorite. It's my favorite part of the book. Yeah, Mazoch was extremely progressive. It was great, right? And to be honest, I have my reading of this book. I take that line about equality, like although it's sort of half jokey, and Mazoch was sort of like he had a great sense of humor. I take that line to be, extremely honest. I think Mazuk was simply saying like his truth there, being like, yeah, none of this would fucking matter if we actually had equality. And this is sort of what Deleuze is saying here, right? You had this sort of patriarchal law that one is forced under in society, right? And so you can either do what, generally has been done in feminism and sort of ascribe a law of a higher law, like sort of law of equality of all people above it, and say, well, this is actually better, and we sort of ascend towards a more better thing. Or you can do the Mazok thing, and you can see the law and be like, let's fucking play with it. Let's be funny, right? And you develop these contracts of possession. You invert you invert the gender structures. Well, Mazok is the one who submits to this idealized Venus, right? And there's this whole play there that ends basically with him saying, yeah, it's all a big joke. Were there equality, nothing of this would happen, and like it wouldn't matter, right? It's so good. I can't explain to people how good that book is. Do you agree with my reading, Ben? Am I onto something? It's fine. What's happening in the general? All right, you're being nerds there. All right, I will not interrupt your nerd talk by a better talk about masochism. Anyways, so as we see Deleuze say here, now this is where I'll end. As we see Deleuze say here, there is the, one eventually from moral law pops into the realm of habit. And what is clear there is that this morality itself does not differ very much from the way in which we think natural law. Ultimately, it has the same type of generalizing, the same type of functioning, right? Which, natural law has, right? It happens on observation. You observe, and you sort of think of it. You observe habits, right? And then through the moral law, you try to change habits, right? It's the habit of acquiring different habits, right? And you try to create repetitions, which happen in there, and which should, according to you, happen in there. But what happens is the same thing that happens in science itself, which is that all these repetitions, sort of like all these repetitions are artificially constrained into a specific framework, through which we can understand them as being repetitious or as being the things that we should repeat. And so, we haven't really moved away from it. And then you see, he says here, like, this can't account for what's really happening, right? He says, as a result, habit never gives us right to true repetition. Sometimes the action changes and is perfected while the intention remains constant, right? Sometimes the action remains the same in different contexts and with different intentions. So we can't really understand what's being repeated, how it's being repeated, what happens there, right? Repetition sort of just appears to just happen, and we have no idea what gives rise to repetition. We can't really understand the repetition itself. We're simply using it to understand something else. And this is the big point here. So here, we are this is the big point for Deleuze. We are obscuring the notion of repetition in order for it to service more general notions such as natural law, moral law, habit, right? And that's his big point. And the way in which, one then can rethink repetition and redevelop it, he posits here as either the masochist way of humor or the way of irony in the last paragraph, right? But we're not going to go in there because I think that's just his introduction for the next part. Right? So that's, honestly, for Deleuze, that is the problem of repetition, and it's as it has been discussed thus far. Like, honestly, it's not. I hope you understand sort of what the problem in philosophy with repetition was, right? It has thus far always been obscured in service of other things, and we have never really thought repetition itself, what gives rise to repetition, how repetition functions. We've assumed our repetition in form of resemblances and equivalences, like things repeat in the same way. Or there's the same sheep looks the same, so the sheep as a species repeats, right? Or morality, like we have set laws which prescribe a certain repetition of future actions, right? But neither of these ways has given us actually understanding of the repetition itself. And for Deleuze, that's a shame, because he sees power in rethinking the notion of repetition, which he's going to develop throughout his book, right? It's not going to happen now. It's not even going to happen in this chapter. It's going to happen in chapter 2 when he talks about repetition and redoes it. In this chapter, he's going to go on. I'll show you the little beginning thingy, right? Just so you see, right? He's gonna talk about, this is what we discussed so far. Right. So we've really, in 2 hours, we've really done just a couple of points, right? But these points are crucial. Like, I don't think you can really get to the rest of the book if you just haven't at least got a cursory understanding of this, right? And then he's going to go through like the repetition according to Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Pegoy, right? Movement, theater, representation. He's going to talk about the concept and the repetition. So it's really rethinking of repetition in philosophy, right? His big statement that repetition is unexplained by identity, right? He hasn't really reached conclusion, and we haven't yet reached the conclusion of what repetition is. We've only said what it's not. We've only said how it can't be this or that, right? As this was generally understood in philosophy, right? And only there, sort of like this last section, like he's going to talk about the death instinct and the repetition compulsion by Freud, which is again really important. But all of this is going to be expanded in the chapter 2. Especially the Freud part. Chapter 2 has a huge section on psychoanalysis, huge one, and a really important one. I think it's the biggest part of chapter 2, right? And then he's gonna, like, his notion of bare and disguised repetition is him sort of providing or hinting at the exit from this problem, but not quite solving it yet, right? Because then the next chapter, which can be treated as, another introductory chapter, chapter 1, difference in itself, does the same thing. Like there's the same movement through the history of philosophy, but this time through the notion of difference, right? Which is the second big concept in the book. And then only in chapter 2 do we get repetition for itself, right? But also difference, right? It's a bit more of a complicated chapter. Right. Is there any questions? Like I hope everybody had fun. I sure did.
Yeah, thanks, Alderon.
Thank you. And we'll go on with this recap soon. Probably next week. I don't know if it's going to be Monday again, but it's going to happen. And I'll stream it. I'll put it on the YouTube if people like have stopped or like have stopped midway and I want to watch more or listen. Who knows? And I will also I haven't recorded this, so I don't know if I can maybe extract the recording from the YouTube video and post it here. Who knows? I should have just added Craig. Maybe next time I do it. Right. That's it. Yeah. So no more questions. Thank you for watching, everyone. Thank you for people who watched on YouTube. Thank you for people who are here with me in the Quarantine Collective Discord server. Please join us again on Discord. And again, I'm saying join us on Discord, discord.gg/TGQC, where we do way more than we are doing right now. There is so much happening there constantly, philosophy-wise. There's so many readings which are not streamed, which are not published. Just, I'll go quickly to the schedule. Just so you know, like there is Desert Islands. I'm not sure. It's another text from Deleuze. Like collection of texts from Deleuze. There is the Society of the Spectacle, Anti-Oedipus, which of course is already also on the YouTube. There is Confucius, which is new. I didn't even know that was happening. I assume that's you, Ben.
Yeah.
Did you say something?
Yeah, or as maybe Ben's doing, the Analects.
Yeah.
And also empiricism and subjectivity.
All right. Yeah, there's going to be more Derrida. We're reading Signature, Event, and Context. We're just waiting for Larve to come back. There is streams from Brooks. There's Spinoza, Deleuze's book on Spinoza. There is my reading of Difference and Repetition. There is Empiricism and Subjectivity. There is Ponty. Ponty is a huge influence on Deleuze and one of the biggest philosophers in French theory. There is this is a new reading of Wittgenstein. There's Carnap and Kierkegaard, Concept of Dread. Now, there's so many things happening. Most of it isn't streamed because I don't think people like streaming that much, which is fine. I mean, I just started it. It's terrifying, especially if like you're only battling a text right now. Yeah, Jack is in the most groups. I assume I've not visited any of them because again I don't have time, but I assume it's as you said, it's extremely fun. I bet it is. Right. So that's it from me. Bye bye. Enjoy your evening, and I'll see you next time with Difference and Repetition.
Yeah.